Hello. Welcome to the international webinar on palm oil-based biofuels policy and socio-environmental impacts in Asia. We are still waiting for some participants to join, so let's give it a couple minutes so that everybody's here. In the meantime, please feel free to grab water or coffee as you like. And we wanted to thank you for joining us today on your busy Monday. I think people are still joining, so I'll give it a couple more minutes. In the meantime, if you have any questions on any technical issues, please feel free to message us. We can see your messages, and we'll try to address that as soon as possible. Thank you. Okay, I think most people have joined, so we're starting the event now. So again, I wanted to thank you all for joining today, and this event is co-organized by 3 NGOs in South Korea, and we are Solutions for Our Climate, SFOC, and Uptick, Advocates for Public Interest Law, and Korea Federation of Environmental Movement, KFEM. We are broadcasting this from South Korea, Seoul, and my name is Sujin Kim, and I'm a senior researcher at SFOC, and I'll take you through the overview of the event today. So there are some housekeeping notes. For the interpretation, pick a language that you like and stick with it, please. So there are 3 channels you can choose from: Korean, English, and Japanese. And yeah, please don't mix it. Just choose one language that you prefer and stick with it through the entire event so that you don't miss out anything. And the participants can send questions at any time during the event, and we'll collect them and answer them in the order of received and during the Q&A session. So let us know if you wish to speak, and then we'll later we'll enable your microphone to intervene during the last part of discussion. And the estimated time for this event is 2 hours and 15 minutes, and we'll try to make it through without a break, because we don't have so much time, and we apologize for that. The webinar is now divided into 2 major parts. So the first part is presentations, and we'll have 5 presentations from Korea, EU, Indonesia, and Japan. And the Japanese presentation will be interpreted from Japanese to English, to Korean as well. So please note that there might be some delays in translation, and thank you so much for your patience in advance. And second, a quick round of question and answers will be followed by discussions by speakers based on the group of questions that we have that have been raised. Then the participants can make comments or questions to further the discussion at the end of the event. And so we will share a link to the presentations and our biofuels report that is going to be launched today by the end of the webinar. So please stay tuned and get the link after the event. So with that, I'm going to start presenting the overview of the event today. So we're talking about biofuels, so-called green fuels. And we've seen many countries introducing new and higher blending mandates for green fuels in the last decade or so. And the current countries that have current mandates are Argentina, Brazil, Japan, and the EU, of course, and the US. For example, EU Red has started about 10 years ago. It's almost 10 years. And there are new countries coming into this picture, including India, who has blending mandates until 2030 by 20%, Indonesia, biodiesel 30% by 2020, Canada, and South Korea, and Singapore are all introducing new measures. With that policy support, we're seeing some uptick demand in global biofuels production. So as you see in this graph, in 2020, it was reduced a little bit because of COVID, but it was rebounded again in 2021, and it's forecasted to grow until 2025 pretty steadily. And that demand is defined by other international climate measures, such as aviation sector fuel switching, which is CORSIA, and International Maritime Organization also has set a new target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in maritime transport. In this slide, I wanted to talk about why Asia and why palm oil. We chose to focus on palm oil because palm oil is the main ingredient of biofuels. And we choose to focus on Asia because that's where the supply and demand is made. So for example, as you can see in this flow of trade, most biofuels are going from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Asia, and then from there and going to Asia or Southeast Asia. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the palm oil imports by country, so which means demand, the highest demand was made in India, China, Pakistan, all Asian countries. And why are we talking about this now? Because many countries are setting net zero goals by 2050. And they did so by including fuel switching plans to green fuels, to biofuels. And we're also waiting to have this COP26 in November in the UK. And this COP is going to be very important because it's called Nature COP, and the important measure of nature. Nature is very important in this topic. And the UK government is hosting it this year, and the UK has recently introduced a legislation to deal with community-driven deforestation. And on the right-hand side, I wanted to talk about the AR6 report by IPCC this year that has alerted us that the carbon budget that we have in the globe is really small, and yeah, we have to rapidly reduce emissions within 10 years to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And our report title is No Good Oil to Burn. Unfortunately, biofuel has been known to be bad fuels in for many reasons, including it being driving deforestation, global food price, and human rights violation, biodiversity loss, and land rights violation as well. So Asia is currently at risk of becoming a new leakage market for unsustainable palm oil due to tougher regulations in the EU and the USA. And I wanted to end my presentation by quoting this report, The Economics of Biodiversity, so-called Dasgupta report, Dasgupta review. Here, they mentioned that the escalating demands for biofuels corresponds to a decline in regulating and maintenance services of nature. And they have mentioned that, yes, of course, the palm oil plantations have increased the productivity by a lot, but at the cost of biodiversity. And with that, I will end my presentation, and I will introduce our next moderator. Yes, Ms. Lin Kim at KFEM. She is going to take over and introduce new speakers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Helen Kim, working at Korea Federation for Environmental Movement. slash Friends of the Earth Korea as an international solidarity activist. It's a really honor to join today's event with great people working on biofuel issues around the world. I hope today's event become a stepping point that we can cooperate more to deal with biofuel problems. Um, without further ado, I will introduce today's first speaker, Shin-Young Chang, who is an attorney and advocate for public interest laws, in short appeal, has been working on supporting victims of human trafficking and human rights violation by Korean companies. And specifically for the last few years, she has been focusing on indigenous people's rights in Korean palm oil companies' concession area. This time, she's going to present overview of South Korea's biofuel policy and key finding of no good oil to burn. So, Shin, are you ready?
Yes. So thank you for the
All right.
introduction. Yeah, my name is Shin-Young from Appeal. So today I will going to summarize the findings from our report. It's a long report, but I'm trying to be concise to share the main findings of our report. So the title of the report, as Sujin shared, is "No Good Oil to Burn." So we focused on biofuel policy in South Korea. 이게 지금 쉐어링이 되고 있나? Okay. So so before we go into the details, so when we say biofuel in this report, we are talking about mainly two types of oil. So biodiesel and bioheavy oil. So I'm sure most of you are aware of what biodiesel means. That's mainly used for transportation fuel, and main feedstocks are from palm oil and palm oil byproducts, and also waste cooking oil. But for bioheavy oil, that's for many of you that must not be really familiar with, because it's only used in Korea to be used for power generation fuel in the power plant. So, but for the main feedstocks for the bioheavy oil is the same. Not exactly the same, but mainly from the palm oil byproducts, and also the pitch leftover from the biodiesel production process. So if you see the overall portion of the bioenergy among renewable energy, it accounts for 27% of Korea's total domestic renewable energy production. But among that bioenergy production, palm oil-based biofuel accounted for about 29%, which is not a small number. So, so we focus on biodiesel first. So if you see the graph in the right hand, you can see the sharp increasing since the adoption of the renewable fuel standard system. As Sujin mentioned, the increase of the use of biodiesel is dependent on the policy of South Korea. So we have this policy called renewable fuel standard system that requires the fuel providers to blend the biodiesel into the original automotive diesel. So the portion of the mandatory percent was originally in 2017, it was 2.5%, and now currently, as of 2021, it's 3.5%. And of course, it's increasing, and by 2030, it is supposed to be increased by 5%. So, but if you can see, the most of the biodiesel used in Korea are produced in Korea by using feedstocks imported. But you can see a small number of biodiesel is also imported, but the increasing amount of the biodiesel is exported to other countries like EU and US. And also about the bioheavy oil, it is also increasing, dependent on the biofuel policy. So there's a policy called Renewable Energy Production Obligations. This requires power plant energy producers to use certain amount of energy production generation by using renewable energy. So in order to do that, the easiest way for the, especially for the oil-fired power units, the easiest way is to use the this bio-heavy oil instead of the original oil. So instead of developing or investing in new solar or with different types of renewable energy generation, these energy producers tend to just use this type of oil. So it's the easiest way. Yes. So naturally, the amount of the imported palm oil and palm oil byproducts is increasing. So if you see the graph provided here, the amount of the palm oil and palm byproducts increased a lot, and almost 3 times between 6 years. But if you see the number or the amount of the domestic feedstocks, it's almost the same, because you see 2014 it was 251, but it has increased to 290 in 2020. So which means people say that this biofuel, biodiesel, is environmentally friendly because it is reusing the waste cooking oil. But if you see the real number, what has driven the increase of the biodiesel is really it's palm oil, not the waste cooking oil. And what that means, increased use of biofuel means there's an increased supply chain, risk of supply chain of palm oil. So I'm sure the presenters, the guest speakers for the later part, we can share details of the harms that palm oil happening in palm oil production. So I'm going to focus more on the Korea side. In Korea, there are many companies using palm oil. They can produce, of course, biodiesel and biofuel, but also large number of chemical companies and also food producers. They all use palm oil, but in Korea there's no law that requires companies to monitor their supply chain. So if you are using palm oil in Korea, there's no way to find out the risks in the supply chain. So that's the real problem. And in addition to the absence of the law, Korean producers and importers of the palm oil, they do not usually adopt any voluntary commitment to monitor or clean their supply chains. So if you are buying biofuel or any products you use palm oil related products, you can't really be sure that your supply chains are really clear if you are buying from the Korean companies. And in addition to those producers using palm oil, there are companies going abroad in Indonesia to develop the oil palm plantations. And Korean government is supporting this development under the purpose of developing resources from the overseas. So this is a huge problem for Korean companies and also Korean government. Yes, and in Korean side, there's another huge problem. So as I shared before, since for the oil-fired power plant, it is the easiest way to use biofuel instead of developing other types of renewable energy. So there's a real case in Jeju Island. So this island is a beautiful island, but it's heavily dependent on the fossil power generation for the past. And they were supposed to change to use more of renewable energy in the island. However, they are using more and more bio-heavy oil instead of developing other types of renewable energy. So there's a good example showing that in last year, wind generation was curtailed due to the excessive power generation. And because of the using bio-heavy oil, there were more large amount of excessive generation of the power. So the wind generation was curtailed. But this will happen in this year again. So we believe that this poses serious risk to to develop the other types of renewable energies. So from our side, we urge Korean governments this. So we believe that currently there's no standard in Korean law or any regulation requiring the companies to consider the environment or social impacts when they produce biofuels. So we believe that Korean government should establish eligibility standards which take into account environmental and social impacts, and especially if the palm oil and agrofuel should be restricted and phased out finally. And we believe that Korean government should adopt the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act in order to require companies to monitor their supply chain. And also for the companies, they should, even though without the laws, they should establish and implement environmental and social policies so that they can monitor and clear out the supply chains without any risks in their supply chain. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you for being on time. This is something that I didn't expect it anyway. Thank you for introducing South Korea's biofuel policy and key findings of no good oil to burn report again. And this time, we'd like to hear legal and policy trends of palm oil-based biofuels in EU from Laura Buffett, Energy Director of Transport and Environment, in short TNE. Laura directs the energy campaigns of TNE and focuses on making European fuel policy more sustainable, especially phasing out the support to land-based biofuels. Okay, let's get into it.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation to speak today. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope everything will work well. I think this is working. So yeah, really happy to be part of that discussion today, and I really hope we can collaborate further in the future based on the results that you've just presented. It's clear that there are common trends between the EU and South Korea and what's happening on the biofuels market. So I hope my presentation can also help you to see what has been achieved in Europe and also how can we collaborate in the future. So I wanted to start by introducing Transport and Environment, because I guess a lot of you might not know us. So we are an NGO based in Brussels. We represent around 63 member organizations across Europe. We are campaigning for cleaner and safer transportation at EU and international level. We have teams working on trucks, cars, ships, aviation, and my team is focusing on energy. So TNE is working not only on regulation and changes EU law, but also on investments, on pricing, and also on corporate change. So as I flagged, my team is working on energy. So we are looking at different alternatives to the use of oil in transport. We've been working for many, many years on biofuels policies, but we also work on other and cleaner alternatives for transport fuels, mainly renewable electricity, but also renewable hydrogen and e-fuels. But today my presentation will only be about biofuels and more specifically palm oil and what the EU has done on that front. So when we talk about fuel policies and biofuels in Europe, the main piece of law we're talking about is the Renewable Energy Directive. It has already been mentioned before, but in 2008-2009, the EU decided to increase the share of renewables generally. And so every EU country had to meet a target of 20% renewable energy overall by 2020. And as part of this target, every country had to meet 10% renewable in transport. To meet that target, EU countries could use several options. First, they could use waste residue biofuels. They could also use renewable electricity or hydrogen. But eventually, they mostly used food-based biofuels because these were the easiest to use and the cheapest. So we ended up with a huge increase in food-based biofuels on the EU market. And already in 2015, because of NGO campaigning and a lot of discussions on biofuels, the EU decided to establish an overall limit on all food-based biofuels. So EU countries cannot count more than 7% food-based biofuels towards their 10% target. That was a first way, a first attempt to mitigate the risks for biodiversity and for climate and also for social rights caused by food-based biofuels. But I will explain more what happened on palm oil later. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that without these policies, biofuels would not be on the market because they're more expensive than fossil fuels. So these policies really drive what's happening on the biofuels market. The Renewable Energy Directive has driven a huge increase in bioenergy use at EU level. So at TNE, we focus only on biofuels, but other NGOs in Europe focus on the other uses of biomass for energy, for example, for electricity or heating. And contrary to what a lot of people think, in Europe, it's not wind and solar which make up the most of the renewable energy share in Europe, but it's actually bioenergy. Bioenergy makes up around 60% of the entire renewable energy at EU level. Since the year 2000, there's been a huge increase in bioenergy use, increased by around 87% from 2000 to 2013. And on the right-hand side, you can see a graph that shows the different types of renewables and their share. And the bottom is really bioenergy, and you can see that it has increased significantly. For transportation, there's been a huge increase as well. And now food-based biofuels make up around 5% of the entire renewable energy in transport. An important concept to study for biofuels policy is the concept of indirect land use change, or ILUC. And we often use that simple infograph to explain what are the leakages of the biofuels policies, not only in Europe, but worldwide. So on the left-hand side, you have a situation without a biofuel policy, where you have a piece of land used to grow crops for food. And on the right-hand side, suddenly you have a biofuels policy in place, which drives extra demand for crops, this time for biofuels. And at EU level, the EU laws prohibit biofuels driving direct deforestation. So you cannot consider sustainable a biofuel that is linked to direct deforestation. However, even if you take that piece of land which has already been used for crops in the past and that did not lead to deforestation, you still need to find new pieces of land somewhere else because you're increasing the demand for agricultural crops. So you need to expand the agricultural frontier elsewhere. And that often happens on high carbon stocks, whether it's forest or peatland. And therefore, even if some biofuels do not drive directly deforestation, they indirectly drive deforestation. And the issue is that the EU law is not fully recognizing the indirect deforestation linked to biofuels. So we've been spending many years campaigning on that front, and I'm going to explain more what happens next. So ILUC can be modeled. There's been several models being used at EU level to try to quantify that deforestation or land use impacts. And the most recent study dates back from 2016. It's called Globiome. And here is an infograph that summarizes. Okay, the recording has started. So here is an infograph that summarizes the main findings of the latest report on land use emissions. Here you can see on the left-hand side, fossil diesel average emissions. And on the right, you see different crop-based biofuels and what are the emissions associated with them when you take into account land use impacts. And you can see that palm-based biofuels appear to be the highest emitting biofuels with around 3 times the emissions of fossil diesel when you take into account these indirect impacts. What's important to know is that at EU level, biodiesel represents around 80% of the biofuel market. So the biofuel market is around 80% biodiesel, 20% ethanol, and most of the biodiesel market is actually crop-based biodiesel. And all the crop-based biodiesel, so all the vegetable oils used for biofuels, increase emissions compared to fossil diesel when you take into account indirect impacts. So now, looking at the type of biofuels used in Europe, we can see similar trends to what has been described earlier regarding South Korea. So you see here a graph that shows the share of different types of vegetable oils into EU biodiesel production starting in 2010 to 2020. And you can see that you have a blue part that stays quite stable at the bottom. This is rapeseed-based biofuel. But then on top, you have a red part that increases and increases over a year. And this part, the red part, is palm oil. And so since 2010, there's been a huge increase in the use of palm oil for biodiesel production. And in 2020, we reached an all-time high with palm oil representing around 30% of EU biodiesel production, and around 58% of all palm oil imports to Europe ending up in the production of EU biodiesel. The most important concern is not only about climate impacts and biodiversity impacts and all the negative impacts linked to palm oil, but it's also the fact that usually EU drivers do not know about it. There's no transparency either at national level or, not even at petrol stations. And so when people try to avoid palm oil in their cookies or wherever in the supermarkets, they actually don't even know that they might end up filling up their cars with palm oil-based biofuels on the other hand. So that's a major concern. And yeah, I'm going to explain what the EU has done to fix that problem. So based on the data about the land use emissions of different biofuels and the trends showing that palm oil was actually the biofuel the most increasing on the EU market, the EU decided to take action against what we call high ILUC risk biofuels. And so the EU took action in two different steps. So the first step was reviewing the Renewable Energy Directive. So I explained that the Renewable Energy Directive was in place until 2020. And so the EU then discussed what to do after 2020 to go from 2020 to 2030. And so for that review of the Renewable Energy Directive, there was a decision taken that said that high ILUC risk biofuels had to be frozen and then phased out of the climate and energy targets progressively. So by 2030, there shouldn't be any high ILUC risk biofuels counted as sustainable at EU level. It's not a ban, it's really just not accounting towards EU climate and energy targets. And in the red, there was a definition of what is considered high ILUC risk. It's a crop-based biofuel for which significant expansion into high carbon stock has been observed in the last years. And the EU decided to adopt a specific piece of law that we call a delegated act. It's becoming a bit complicated, to then specify what would qualify as high ILUC risk. So that's only on high ILUC risk, but what you need to know is that there were other measures in that review of the Renewable Energy Directive, including, again, a limit on all food-based biofuels to avoid an increase of the use of food-based biofuels after 2020. So the EU took action not only on high ILUC risk, but also on all food-based biofuels more generally to prevent that these fuels will make up most of the targets after 2020. And so following the adoption of the Renewable Energy Directive in 2018, the EU finally adopted a delegated regulation in 2019. And this time it specifies what type of biofuels would qualify for a phase out. And based on the report by the Joint Research Center, which is the scientific arm of the Commission, they released a huge report that is accessible online. They also held stakeholder meetings, and there was an open consultation as well. And finally, they decided that significant expansion would mean that a crop has expanded with more than 10% on a high carbon stock. And because of this, palm oil qualifies as high ILUC risk biofuel and therefore will be phased out of EU targets by 2030. They looked also at other crops, not only palm oil, but soy, for example, is associated only with 8% expansion on high carbon stocks, according to the report of the Commission. In addition to that, there are exceptions to the phase out. So the general principle is that palm oil-based biofuels should not count anymore by 2030, but you have a list of criteria that some palm oil could meet and therefore could still be considered okay to be used as a renewable energy for meeting renewable targets in the EU. An important point is that at EU level, you have the EU rules, but member states can decide to take more progressive decisions on matters related to energy and the environment. And here you have several member states which decided to phase out palm and sometimes soy earlier than what the EU said. So here you have a graph that shows that 9 countries have either already adopted rules or are in the process of adopting rules to phase out soy and palm oil earlier than 2030. France, Austria, Denmark, Portugal, Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, they've already adopted the rules, and Belgium and Italy are in the process of finalizing the laws that would phase out, hopefully, palm and soy earlier than 2030. Because of the EU action on high aluc risk biofuels and also national member states taking specific rules on this, there have been 2 WTO cases brought forward in the recent years. So first one was in December in 2019, launched by Indonesia against the EU and against the EU delegated regulation. And here the final report of the WTO panel is not expected before the second quarter of 2022. And then there was a new case as well brought by this time Malaysia, not only against the EU, but also against France and Lithuania for their implementation of the rules. For these 2 cases, you have third parties as well in the case. And in that example, the Republic of Korea is a third party to these 2 cases with other countries like Colombia as well. On this WTO question, if you are interested to know more, we've commissioned a legal analysis that we published in 2019, and it's available online on our website, and you can find it in my presentation after that event. Now, moving on from palm oil, I also wanted to spend some time to speak about soy-based biofuels. Because one thing to pay attention to is that when the EU is hopefully now phasing out the use of palm oil in biofuels, we're likely to see a gap on the market if member states do not reduce their targets for biofuels at the same time. And there could be a scenario whereby palm oil will be replaced by soy-based biofuels. But we've seen before that, no vegetable oil has actually better climate impacts than fossil diesel. So we really do not want that to happen. We've released a recent study at the end of last year, commissioned to Serology, and it demonstrated that based on the latest available data, soy could actually be associated with the expansion on high carbon stock of 10.5%. That would mean that it would qualify for the definition of high aluc risk. And so we really recommend the Commission and EU decision makers to phase out soy-based biofuels immediately together with palm oil and not to wait too long to avoid new negative impacts on biodiversity, land use, and climate. And what's interesting to know is that at EU level, there's been lots of discussions in the last years about the EU Green Deal, climate ambition. And in May this year, EU member states and the EU Parliament finally agreed on having climate neutrality for the EU by 2050. And they also agreed on a net greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 55% by 2030. And so to achieve this target, the Commission in July this year released a huge package of measures looking at taxation, carbon markets, land use, renewable energy, to ensure that the EU would actually meet that target of 55% reduction, net reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. As part of that package, the Renewable Energy Directive will be reviewed. So far, the Commission does not propose to change any really specific rules on food-based biofuels or on palm oil, so the phase-out stays there. The limit on food-based biofuels is still there, but there will be discussions in the coming year and maybe more on these issues. So it's important to keep an eye on what's going on at EU level on that front. What's also important to know is that the EU has proposed for the first time specific pieces of law on the use of alternative fuels in aviation and shipping. So it's an important step to tackle the emissions from these two sectors. And the good news is that for the moment, food-based biofuels cannot qualify towards these two proposals because they're unsustainable, and the EU recognizes that. So we really hope that for the Renewable Energy Directive and these two proposals, there will be even more action towards reducing the amount of food-based biofuels, palm oil and soy specifically. And so I just wanted to finish by highlighting our main recommendations for the upcoming revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. So first, we ask palm and soy-based biofuels to be phased out immediately, not in 2030, because it's just too late. We also ask the exemptions to be removed so that really no food-based biofuels can make it to the EU climate and energy target. And that will mean also phasing out all crop-based biofuels, including rapeseed, wheat, etc., by 2030. As I said, we do not want aviation and shipping to become new drivers of biofuels, especially of food-based biofuels. That's really crucial. And finally, we ask decision makers to make sure that there's more support dedicated to the cleaner alternatives that we have on the market, meaning mainly renewable electricity, and where direct electrification is not possible, more support should be given to renewable based hydrogen or e-fuels, especially for sectors like aviation and shipping. And I will end my presentation here. Thanks a lot for your attention and looking forward to the discussion and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing legal and policy trends of palm oil-based biofuels in the EU. This time, we are going to learn Japanese biofuels policy trend and supply chain risks from Sayako Inoma at Global Environmental Forum, in short GEF. She has been advocating for the enactment of law against illegal logging and sustainable guideline on biomass power generation. Sayako, you have 15 minutes. Please be punctual as we are slightly delayed so far. So, yeah, let's dive in.
はい、こんにちは。共有できましたでしょうか？できてますかね。はい。本日は、シンポジウムにお招きいただきまして、どうもありがとうございます。私は、ちょっと国際シンポジウムなどで発表するのは初めてなので、少々緊張しておりますが、ご容赦ください。私は飯沼小夜子と申します。東京にある、地球人間環境フォーラムという NGO とシンクタンクの中間のような、財団法人のスタッフです。森林、パーム油、バイオマスエネルギーの持続可能性をテーマに活動しています。本日は特にバイオマスエネルギーとしてのパーム油の問題についてお話しします。ちょっと待ってくださいね。ごめんなさい。この活動は、プランテーションウォッチという10年ほど前にできた6つの NGO のコアリションによって進めています。このご覧の、ロゴがその NGO のものです。で、本日の内容はご覧の通りです。まず、これまでにプランテーションウォッチとして進めてきたパーム油の責任ある調達を求める取り組みについて、次にバイオマス発電とパーム油の問題、最後にパーム油発電の持続可能性基準と、その成果と課題についてお話しします。パーム油の生産地、インドネシア、マレーシアの環境社会問題については、近年知られるようになってきましたが、プランテーションウォッチが活動を始めた頃はまだ日本ではあまり理解されていませんでした。環境問題としては、まず大規模な油やし農園開発による森林減少と、農園開発によると関係する森林や泥炭の火災の発生があります。また、森林減少や泥炭開発の影響による膨大な温室効果ガスの排出、世界有数の豊かな生物層を誇る熱帯林の転換による生物多様性の影響などが代表的な問題です。他にも農薬や化学肥料、工場からの排液による水質汚染などもあります。パーム油の生産に起因する社会問題としては、大規模な開発により地域住民の生活や文化に多大な影響を及ぼしています。また、土地をめぐる地域住民との紛争も年間数百から数千件というレベルで起きています。大規模な事業で巨額の資金が動くために、不正や汚職の温床になりやすいとも知られています。農園ができた後は、その労働者の人権問題が指摘されています。 これらのさまざまな問題に対して、消費国日本側からはどのような解決が求めていけるでしょうか。2020年の日本におけるパーム油の消費量は、パーム角油と合わせて83.4万トンでした。これはインド、中国、EU などと比べるとわずかな量と言えますが、需要は増え続けています。先ほど述べたように、パーム油生産はさまざまな環境社会問題と関わっているので、消費側が責任ある調達を心がけることによって、生産地の問題抑止につながっていくと考えています。責任ある調達というのは、持続可能なパーム油認証とされる、RSPO 認証への調達をすればよいということではありません。認証というのは常に発展途上であり、認証基準が良くても現場での問題を把握できないこともあります。ですから私たちはパーム油に関しては NDPE ポリシーの採用と実施を企業に求めています。NDPE というのは No Deforestation、No Peat、No Exploitation ということで、RSPO 認証では不足する部分を企業が自ら確認することを推奨しています。プランテーションウォッチではパームユーザー企業に対してアンケート調査をもとに、取り組みランキングを毎年公表しています。また、特に影響の大きい企業に対してダイアログを行ったり、機関投資家を通じたエンゲージメントによって NDPE の採用と実施を求めています。ここから、バイオマスエネルギーとしてのパーム油問題です。日本では再生可能エネルギー固定価格買取制度 FIT が2012年に始まりました。電力消費者が支払う賦課金によって再エネの普及促進を図る制度です。再生可能エネルギー事業で認定を受けた事業者は20年間にわたり市場よりも高い価格で再生可能エネルギー電力を販売することができます。この制度の目的は環境負荷の低減、国内の産業振興、地域の活性化となっています。経産省が単独で所管しており、このフィット制度によりバイオマス発電の認定量が急増しました。でバイオマス発電の中でも、特にパーム油発電はディーゼル発電機があれば、でき、パーム油の調達も比較的容易でした。このため、2017年のバイオマス発電認定量のうち、パーム油発電が 38%、PK を含むと、全体の 83% が油足由来の燃料を使用することとなっていました。NGO がパーム油の問題について情報提供や、提言を始めたのは2016年の後半で、その後、経産省ではバイオマス発電のガイドラインを作成し、パーム油は RSPO 認証のみに限定することとなりました。さらにそれまで24円と非常に高かったバイオマス発電の調達価格を2018年から入札制としたことで、フィットバイオマス発電はそれほどうまみのないものになりました。しかしそれ以前の認定量だけで2030年の政府のバイオマス発電目標量の2倍に達しています。現在の日本におけるパーム油発電所の状況です。2017年時点で稼働していたパーム油のみを燃やす発電所は4社でした。そのうち1社は騒音と悪臭で地域住民に多大な被害を及ぼしていましたが、2020年に廃業しました。残り3社はコロナの影響で燃料調達ができず、現在停止中となっています。2020年の1月に新たに稼働した HIS 社、これは旅行代理店で写真のものですけれども、こちらも稼働した直後から停止しています。その他、2019年に発覚した、京都の建設計画は住民運動により同じく、2020年にカナダの投資企業が撤退しました。つまり現時点で日本で稼働しているパーム油発電所はありません。しかしその主な理由はパーム油価格の高騰などで状況が変われば稼働する可能性があります。 また、マレーシアとインドネシアの国別認証をフィットの対象として認めさせるという動きがあり、これらが認められると、パーム油発電は新規建設を含め、再び増え始める可能性があります。これはバイオマス発電のライフサイクルでの温室効果ガス排出量について、経産省のワーキンググループに提出されたグラフです。横線は、化石燃料の温室効果ガス排出量です。バイオマスは土地利用転換と、燃焼による CO2 の排出量が含まれていません。にもかかわらず、非常に排出量が多いことがわかると思います。パーム油が2つあるのは、廃液ポンドのメタン処理をしている場合としていない場合です。実際にはほとんど、8割ぐらいは処理していないです。で、これは同じ経産省のワーキンググループに提出された資料で、油吉農園のうち熱帯林を開発した場合はそうでない場合の約5倍、泥炭地を開発した場合は約139倍、P ケースの場合も、114倍の温室効果ガスが出ると示されています。つまりパーム油発電はそもそも、ライフサイクルでの温室効果ガスが高い上、開発地の中に少しでも泥炭地が含まれている場合、排出量はとてつもなく大きくなります。で、フィットのバイオマス発電の持続可能性についてお話しします。バイオマス発電の事業計画ガイドラインは2017年に作られ、それ以降毎年改定されています。パーム油の持続可能性確認方法として RSPO 認証を求め、非認証油の混入は不可としました。これらの認証油、IP と SG と呼ばれますが、値段も高く生産量は限定的であり、パーム油の燃料利用のハードルになりました。しかし RSPO 認証には温室効果ガスの排出基準はありません。そのため私たちは RSPO は再エネの持続可能性の認証として適切ではないと考えています。2019年にはバイオマス持続可能性ワーキンググループというものが、経産省で設置され、木質バイオマスの持続可能性やバイオマス発電の GHG について専門的な議論が行われることが期待されていますが、実際には不十分な状況です。このワーキンググループにおいて、マレーシアとインドネシアの国際認証 MSPO と ISPO の基準が、RSPO の2013年の基準と同等と言えるかどうかが毎年、繰り返し議論されています。NGO から見て、このワーキンググループ、持続可能性ワーキンググループを評価できる点としては、これまで日本政府が避けてきた認証基準の比較というものを行ったという点です。日本政府はこれまで林野庁も環境省も国際認証はすべて同列という扱いをしてきました。実際には様々な違いがあり、認証として信頼性も異なります。バイオマス持続可能性ワーキンググループでは、パーム油の認証について環境、社会、労働、ガバナンスなどの、基準の内容を比較し、フィットで求められる基準を満たすかどうかの検討を行いました。フィットパーム油発電の課題に対する経産省の対応です。1つ目の課題は、パーム油のライフサイクルGHG の排出量の多い点。経産省は、バイオマスはカーボンニュートラルという立場を取り続け、森林が農地転換された場合のみ、炭素ストックの減少を計上するということを提案しています。今年、環境省が輸入バイオマス発電のライフサイクル GHG に関するガイドラインを発表しましたが、パーム油はこれにも合致していません。2番目の課題として、今年の春に改定されたバイオマス事業計画ガイドラインでは、新規の燃料について、農産物、過食の燃料はフィット対象外とすることになりました。しかし、パーム油は主産物であり、かつ過食ですが、すでに認められている燃料なので、そのままフィット対象とすることになっています。課題の3番目は、認証による持続可能性の確保です。 先ほども述べた通り RSPO に加え MSPO を含めるかどうか、今年検討されています。しかし MSPO は、まだ基準の改定も終わっておらず、終わっていません。また、MSPO は取得が義務となっています。このため私たち NGO はマレーシア産パーム油がすべてフィットの燃料となってしまうことを懸念しています。最後に、フィットの目的とパーム油発電の整合性を振り返って終わりにしたいと思います。第一の目的はエネルギー自給率を上げることなんですが、パーム油発電は輸入依存であり、達成できません。第2は、環境負荷の少ないエネルギーを増やすこと、つまり温室効果ガス排出の抑制ですが、パーム油は、ご覧の通り化石燃料よりも大きいため、これも達成できません。3番目は、環境関連産業や雇用を創出し、地域を振興することなんですが、パーム油も 100% 輸入依存で、地域振興の効果も非常に薄いと言えます。このように、フィットの目的はいずれもパーム油発電では達成できません。加えて、バイオマス発電はコストの7割が燃料費であり、20年間のフィット買い取り期間終了後に発電所が経済的に自立することは不可能です。つまり、再生可能エネルギーの産業育成にもなりません。環境 NGO は繰り返し主張しています。持続可能ではなく、気候変動対策にもならないパーム油発電はフィットの対象外とすべきであることを。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Sayako. Thank you for being punctual. Okay, from now on, we are going to listen to our Indonesian colleagues. As you all might know, Indonesia is the center for production and selling of palm oil, which is one of the main resources of biofuel. This time, Ricky Amok, the engagement manager of Traction Energy Asia, will talk about Indonesia's domestic biofuel production, consumption, and trade policy. So let's hear it.
Yeah, can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ricky Ampi from Traction Energy Asia. We are Jakarta-based NGO that use policy analysis to speed up Indonesia transition to clean energy and low carbon growth. Thank you for the opportunity given to us to share our knowledge on biodiesel in Indonesia. Yeah. Currently, Indonesia is running a mandatory B33 biodiesel program, which means we need to mix our diesel fuel with 30% biodiesel. Biodiesel has a big role in Indonesia renewable energy. So in 2020, the percentage of renewable energy has reached 11% of the total primary energy mix, and biodiesel accounts for 35% of the total renewable energy. Yeah, this year, government target 9.2 million kiloliters for domestic biodiesel consumption. Unfortunately, biodiesel in Indonesia still has some problems, especially on the upstream level. Yeah, Indonesia biodiesel still relies on one feedstock, namely crude palm oil or CPO. Palm oil in Indonesia still has several problems in environmental, data, and sustainability standards. I would like to give you an overview of palm oil plantation in Indonesia. Currently, Indonesia has 27 million hectare concession area, 8 million hectare of plantation outside concession, and 11 million hectare plantation in concession. Existing palm oil in plantation and concession still contain around 3.3 million hectare of forest and 18 million hectares of peatland. This data is debatable. Why? Because all reliable institutions, they have their own version of data. That's why I mentioned at the beginning that the data is also a problem because of lack of coordination and transparency. Yeah, we and Madani is our partner in Indonesia, try to do a study, map. We try to overlay with this map, with a map of the location of palm oil mills indicate as a biodiesel supplier using spatial approach. We want to capture the situation around the plantation, the palm oil mills. The study area is in purple, and then calculated by including all land within a 25-kilometer radius of palm oil mills in the blue one. Total is like a 37 million hectares. We choose 25-kilometer radius because we consider it in terms of efficiency, logistics, and also emission. And we assume that plantation within the radius are plantations that supply biodiesel feedstock. Inside the study area, we capture 6 million hectares of concession area, 5 million hectares of plantation outside the concession, and then 8 million hectare plantation in concession. And existing palm oil plantation and concession in study area still contain around 1 million hectares of forest and 2.9 million hectares of peatland. Then let's look the supply chain from upstream to downstream of biodiesel in Indonesia. In our preliminary findings, there is 13 million hectares existing palm oil in plantation and concession still contain 1 million hectares of forest and 2.9 million hectares of peatland involved. And 137 palm oil mills out of total of 644 are SFO certified. Kindly note, because of lack of transparency, only 39 mills out of the 644 can be verified by document as biodiesel feedstock supplier to the business group, and among these verified the seller, only 10 mills are SFO certified. So this palm oil mills and 10 palm oil business group become suppliers for 51 biodiesel producer, and 2 out of 10 business groups still have no NDPE commitment. These results are still preliminary. We still need to verify them in the field, but unfortunately, under the current COVID situation, field work is still restricted. Then let's look at the CBO balance. In calculation this balance, we use the business as usual assumption, starting from export, domestic consumption, and increase of production. From our prediction, the current P30 program has the potential to make Indonesia CPO deficit with 34 million tons by 2025. If we want to avoid land use change, the government must do replanting to incentivize 3.8 million hectares of land. The replanting program is needed because the productivity of palm oil in Indonesia is still low, which is in the range of 12 until 14 tons of FFB per hectare per year. Then if P40 is implemented, the cumulative supply deficit to 2025 will reach 71 million tons and require 7.9 million hectares of replanting to avoid land use change. We only provide scenario based on our prediction. We find it difficult to provide scenario according to real conditions because until now, Indonesia does not have a clear biodiesel roadmap yet. Our current biodiesel policy are still reactive depending on the state of CPO market. If the demand and the price of CPO is high, the government will delay the increasing the mix. Otherwise, if the demand and price of CPO is low, they will boost the mix, which will have the potential of to deforestation and land use change. Then, if land use change occurs, biodiesel emission will be much higher than fossil diesel. If we calculate using life cycle analysis or LCA, the result is that if biodiesel use land from primary forest, the emission will be 20 times bigger than fossil diesel, and so on, as can be seen in this graph. We did this calculation in 2019, so we still use the B20 assumption. So P30 emission could be even higher if there is LUC needed. And then for your information, Indonesia terminated agreement with Norway on 1 billion reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation, or REDD plus theme. We don't know yet whether it has anything to do with the request for 15 million hectares of land for biodiesel from Arifin Tasrif, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, in November 2020, and the palm oil moratorium, which will end on September 19 this year. Then what's the solution? Yeah, independent smallholder are key for sustainable biodiesel supply chain. Why? First, land. While independent smallholder account for around 40% of Indonesia's total area of palm oil plantation, they still don't have benefit from the biodiesel program. Second, improving smallholder livelihood, you can put them in the biodiesel scheme. Including independent palm oil smallholder in the biodiesel supply chain will help improve livelihood and reduce poverty. Third is avoiding deforestation. You can involving independent smallholder in the biodiesel supply chain can reduce the risk of deforestation and protect remaining natural forest. And fourth is reducing greenhouse gas emission. Using FFP or fresh fruit farms cultivated by independent smallholder can reduce emission throughout the entire biodiesel production cycle. The emission from companies is 2.97 kilogram CO2 equivalent per liter biodiesel, and emission from smallholder is 0.91 until 1.09 kilogram CO2 equivalent per liter biodiesel, which is half of the company's emission. Yeah, or the other solution is we can also use another feedstock, namely used cooking oil or UCO. Consumption of cooking oil in Indonesia reached 13.1 million tons or 16.2 million kiloliters in 2019. Based on this consumption, Indonesia has the potential of 3.5 until 5.6 million kiloliters of biodiesel from used cooking oil. If we take it into account the depreciation of the used cooking oil and its conversion. Therefore, biodiesel from used cooking oil has the potential to save on the use of crude palm oil or CPO, which will be in line with avoiding land use change of up to 939,000 until 1.48 million hectares. And it can also contribute 38 until 60% of the current biodiesel needs. UCO has a huge potential, and the current use of biodiesel UCO in the world continues to increase. Sadly, only about 3 million kiloliters of used cooking oil can be collected. So it leaves around 4 until 5 million kiloliters of used cooking oil, which are possibly being waste and polluting the soil and water. Of the 3 million kiloliters collected, 184,000 kiloliters of used cooking oil were successfully exported to various European countries, Singapore and USA. What is worrying is that 2.43 million kiloliters of used cooking oil still reprocessed into consumption cooking oil. As we know, consuming reconditioned cooking oil is very dangerous for health and can cause several cardiovascular disease and cancer. And as much as 570,000 kiloliters is generated for biodiesel and other use such as soap, animal feed, candles, and etc. Okay, from this slide, we want to know the trade of biodiesel in Indonesia. We can see the production, domestic consumption, and also export of biodiesel in Indonesia. Biodiesel production in Indonesia continues to increase from year to year. This increase is in line with the increase in domestic consumption. This can be happen due to several factors. One of the factors is the rejection of palm oil, Indonesia palm oil and biodiesel commodities in several markets because of lack of sustainability, transparency, and also traceability. And also, this is data from trademap.org showing importing countries for biodiesel from Indonesia. This is Spain, and then China, Netherlands, Italy, and also South Korea. Yeah, actually, Indonesia is already started discussing the sustainability of biodiesel standard, namely IPSI, or Indonesia Bioenergy, from the Global Bioenergy Partnership, or GBEP, but unfortunately watered down and still to be agreed following 5 years of debate. Before, GBEP have 24 indicators, and now it's only 10 indicators are still holding on at IPSI. Okay, the key point, what we want to emphasize here is traceability and transparency of palm oil biodiesel feedstock in Indonesia are very undeveloped. Currently, no biodiesel feedstock and from crude palm oil can be verified as sustainable because it is not transparent and traceable. Indonesia's domestic standard, or ISPO, doesn't include biodiesel yet. Sustainability indicators are still being discussed and agreed upon the Indonesia Bioenergy Sustainability Indicator, or IPSI. This process has so far taken 5 years from the start of Indonesia Biodiesel Program progressively in 2016. While Indonesia Biodiesel Program currently prioritizes domestic consumption, there are indicators from Indonesia government and some state-owned enterprise, namely Pertamina, that there are plans to increase export of biodiesel using used cooking oil feedstock. And also Indonesia could start producing the feedstock for biodiesel verified as sustainable if it was sourced from small independent farmer because it's more traceable, more transparent, and also waste material such as used cooking oil, which Indonesia generates in abundance, were used. Currently, the use of waste material to produce transportation fuel is not regulated yet under the authority of Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, or ESDM. And also, as no palm oil feedstock for biodiesel produced in Indonesia can currently verify to be deforestation free, and the risk of future deforestation will increase in the biodiesel plant if there is no positive development. We recommend the following approach. First, to emphasizing the importance of sustainable source of to your portfolio, which means is for if you are investor, and also ask the supplier what the sustainability standard or indicator Indonesia use to monitor sustainability of biodiesel feedstock, and also inquire about the availability of biodiesel produced using alternative sustainable feedstock. Example, using waste cooking oil, which is second generation, and feedstock from smallholder. Yeah, last for me, the climate crisis is indeed a global problem, but rejecting a country leading commodity can be backfire. Biodiesel in Indonesia is an example when foreign market can no longer accommodate Indonesian crude palm oil. The government responds by issuing mandatory and enforcing it at the national level, which has the potential to harm the environment. The collaboration is needed instead of leaving someone behind. We have been discussed with CDP, or Carbon Disclosure Project, and their investor network, and we are agreed to push biodiesel from smallholder and developing second generation biodiesel from used cooking oil, because the biodiesel biodiesel industry in Indonesia itself already invested 1.2 billion US dollars. It will be hard to just get rid of it. We also need global strategy to tackle harmful or high-risk biodiesel because other countries' policy really impact in Indonesia biodiesel policy as well. Thank you. That is for me. For further question, you can contact me via email, WhatsApp, or Signal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky, for your presentation. Yes, so far we have been listening South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, and EU's biofuel policy trend. This time, we'd like to hear what's really happening on the field to supply palm oil. Dimas Navian Hartno, Director of WAHI Central Kalimantan, will talk about biofuel supply chain risk in Indonesia, sharing local community perspective. Dimas?
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I will try to share my screen. Okay. Hello, my name is Dimas Navian Hartono, Executive Director of WAHI Central Kalimantan. WAHI works in environmental issues, human rights, climate change, advocacy, and campaign related to environmental condition in Indonesia. WAHI National Executive is based in Jakarta and has WAHI Regional Executive in 28 provinces, one of which is in Central Kalimantan. Right now, I will try to present my presentation is about biofuel supply chain risk in Indonesia, sharing local community perspective. A lot of major issues relate to oil palm plantation. The first is upstream, and the second is governance, and the third is downstream. Upstream level is talk about land tenure, fire, and conflict. About land tenure, here we will talk about the problem of land, fire, and conflict. Oil plantation, the official government figure are still processing data, and we have found the fact that nearly 20 million hectares of oil palm, most of the violation are plantations that do not have HGU or permits, land use permit, and permit for plantation. While he noted that 61.46% of the land is controlled by corporation in the plantation, forestry, mining, and oil and gas sector. This very high inequality is confirmed by the 213 Central Statistic Agency, or BPS, Badan Pusat Statistik, land tenure ratio data, which reached 0.68.31. This means that 1% of Indonesia population control 68% of land. Comparison of identification result of oil palm plantation in Indonesia, difference in plantation data between ministry in Indonesia, the occurrence of very large difference in each government institution. This is what created a gap and must be resolved by the government itself. For example, the Ministry of Agriculture, which oversees oil plant plantation, has data on an area of 20 million hectares, different from the data held by other institutions. You can see it in Badan Informasi Geospasial, or we can talk about the institution about mapping is only 17.9 million hectares. And this in Central Kalimantan, we can see that in Central Kalimantan, oil palm plantation are more than 3 million hectares, even almost 4 million hectares. But those who have had the entire licensing process are 1.8 million hectares. And the mining area is 1.8 million hectare, and forest industry is 5.4 million hectare. You can see that a lot of overlap until right now and never resolved. And we can talk about the fire. We all know that in Indonesia, forest and land fires occur almost every year. The location of these fires are almost all over Indonesia. The large fires occurred in 1997, 202, 215, and 219. The picture above is a hotspot in Indonesia in 2019 with more than 71,000 hotspots between January and December 2019. Total of 5,000.8 hotspots occurred on oil palm plantation permits, and over 36,000 hotspots were located in peatland. Most of the peat area in Indonesia are areas that already have permits for oil palm plantation and other permits. And you can see, if you can see that in peatland, a lot of palm oil make the land is fire because they open the land with fire and make big fire in that years. This is in Central Kalimantan. A lot of palm oil in Central Kalimantan in peatland area, and the fire in 2019 is about it's about 100 million hotspot, more 100 million hotspot. This is the picture in Central Kalimantan in 2019. You can see that the difference between area palm oil and the burn area. After they burn this area, they make this area into palm oil again. In conflict, plantation conflict in the last 5 years always ranked higher. Until the end of 2019, there were 87 plantation conflict. Even in March 2020, in pandemic status, 2 farmers in Lahat, South Sumatra, were killed by plantation security. In Central Kalimantan, Central Kalimantan record that there were 345 land conflict between communities and companies with an area of around in 151,000.524 hectare. We compiled this data from 205 to 219. This is Kinipan, area who protect by indigenous people, but right now is open by oil palm plantation. The 2 pictures above are picture of rainforest destruction on the land of the Kinipan indigenous peoples. On August 26, 2020, the leader of indigenous people were arrested by the police without using the correct procedure. In the last month, 6 people were arrested for defending their forest area. The government, transparency, law enforcement, false solution. The Republik Indonesia Audit Agency, or we call Badan Pemeriksa Keuangan, in February 2019 issued a permit, certification, and management audit report on oil palm plantation. Oil palm plantation covering area of 2,749,000 hectares are located in forest area illegally. The obligation to build community plantation for 20% of the concession is unknown. 83.66% of the of the oil palm plantation company are not ISPO certified and have not been sanctioned. This is three aspects of natural resource management and plantation in Indonesia. First is governance of natural resource minus public interest. Allocation of investment space bring inequality access to natural resource. Allocation of investment space minus people's living space. Many permits are given without looking at the actual condition because the granting of permits is only on the table. Well, what happened in the field, a lot of community lands have existed for a long time and even from generation to generation. B, descents and contribution to deforestation. Permits are granted in forest area that still have a good forest stand, not on critical land, so that these still forested locations are eventually cut down and cause of extensive forest damage. Two, the recognition of people management area are very complex. The partnership obligation between the community and the plantation company are not properly implemented. In the plantation law, companies are required to develop palm oil plantation for the communities covering an area of 20% of the total area that has been allowed to become partners. But this has never happened. Threat to independent community natural resource management enterprise. Many community localization that have been managed for the generation and use traditional wisdom, such as customary forests, are considered unproductive for the region and are considered ancient. Communities request for forest management permission. There are social forestry schemes that can be managed by the community provided they meet the requirements set by the government and seem to create likely bureaucracy and granting permits to the community. And the third is investment culture in conflict room. Extensive conflict and criminalization against indigenous community. Although there are rules in the process of resolving conflict between company and the community, but this does not work optimally. And people who defend their territory will be criminalized because they are considered to have interfered with the investment. Overlapping between license in granting permit, there is often an overlap that causes conflict between oil palm plantation companies or with other permits such as mining and forestry industry. And downstream problem is in managing subsidy fund and export levies for biofuel. You can see that the use of palm oil plantation fund is used up for the biofuel subsidy program. The Corruption Eradication Commission made a study on the commodity management system for oil palm plantation in 2016. Regulation of the Minister of Finance, number 57, PMK 0.05, 220, concerning tariff for public service bodies of the oil palm plantation fund management agency, or Indonesia Tarif Layanan Badan Layanan Umum Badan Pengelola Dana Perkebunan Kelapa Sawit, BPDPKS. The regulator mandate should the fund be for smallholder. BPDPKS in 2015 state that the largest use of funds was still allocated for biodiesel, which reached 89%. Meanwhile, for oil plant rejuvenation, human resource development and management planning, is only 1%. 5 large-scale oil palm corporations receive subsidy from the palm oil plantation fund management agency, totaling in Indonesia 7.5 trillion during January until September 2017, which in Wilmar Group, you can see that, Wilmar Group, Musimas, Darmek, and First Resource, and others. So you can see in biofuel first, our country gives subsidy for the plantation, oil plantation, not to the smallholder plantation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimas, for sharing major issues related to oil palm plantation in Indonesia. That's all for the presentation of today's event. Now we are going to move on to Q&A and discussion session. I know it was being a little bit delayed. However, it would be really appreciated if you could hold on to your seat to the end. I'm going to leave it to Sujin, moderator of this session. Sujin,
Thank you.
are you
Thank
ready?
you, Lynn.
Okay.
And thank you all the presenters today. You've done really good, and we've got so many good examples from the EU, Japan, Indonesia. Now we're going to talk about, let's see if there's questions on the Q&A. I think the first question that was received is about the used cooking oil. And maybe I can address, maybe I can ask if Shin-Young could address that. So there was a question about renewable energy policy having difficulties with location and palm-based biofuels having issues with environmental and human rights. However, if used cooking oils can be utilized, could it replace the volume of the palm or other crop-based biofuels?
네, 그 폐식용유 관련해서 질문을 주셨는데 저희가 이 보고서 관련해서 정확히 그 내용을 정리를 해뒀는데요. 사실 바이오 연료, 바이오 디젤이 정확히는 바이오 디젤이 친환경이다라고 홍보를 굉장히 많이 해왔는데 그 주요 원인이 이렇게 폐식용유를 재활용하기 때문에 친환경이다라고 이제 많이 홍보를 해왔습니다. 그런데 이제 저희가 그 바이오 디젤의 원료로 폐식용유가 얼마나 쓰이고 있는지에 대해서 조사를 했는데요. 사실은 저희가 조사를 했다기보다 바이오 에너지 협회에서 발표한 자료에 따르면 2009년에는 77,000톤 정도의 폐식용유를 바이오 디젤의 원료로 활용을 했는데 2020년에는 175,400톤의 폐식용유를 활용했다고 합니다. 그런데 이 양이 국내에서 확보가 가능한 최대치의 근사한 양이라고 합니다. 그래서 보시면은 바이오 디젤의 원료로 폐식용유가 수입이 증가하고 있는 것을 보실 수 있습니다. 그래서 2009년도에 16,000톤의 폐식용유가 수입이 됐었는데 2020년에는 65,200톤 정도 한 4배가 되는 폐식용유가 수입이 되고 있습니다. 그런데 폐식용유가 수입이 될 때는 또 이 폐식용유의 서플라이 체인이 이제 명확하지 않다라는 문제가 있는데요. 오늘 발제를 해주셨던 TNE에서도 정확히 이 문제에 대해서 최근에 보고서를 발표를 하셨습니다. 그 내용을 보면은 중국에서 오는 폐식용유가 사실은 진짜 폐식용유도 아니고 재활용되는 기름이 아닌 경우, 그래서 리스크가 굉장히 이제 증가하고 있다라는 내용으로 그렇게 발표가 되었는데 우리나라에서도 사실은 폐식용유의 대부분은 중국에서 오고 있습니다. 그래서 이렇게 지금 계속 굉장히 많은 양의 폐식용유를 사용해서 바이오디젤 생산량을 늘려가는 것은 진정한 해법이 될 수 없다라는 것이 저희의 입장입니다.
Thank you very much for the for answering the question. The next question received was for Ricky. Ricky, I hope you're there. So the question for you is, do you think that verification for smallholders can be a burden for certain smallholders, especially for indigenous people whose land rights may not be fully recognized? Verification demands legal clarity of the land rights. The state, on the other hand, may only be willing to provide very limited form of recognition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Of course, this will be burdensome for smallholder. That's why we propose a partnership between smallholder and companies, in which smallholders will be assisted with certain incentive for certificate, sustainability standard, and also to boost their productivity. We have calculated using benefit cost analysis, and it is possible. If you want to read more about the partnership and benefit cost analysis that we made, you can access it in Traction Energy Asia website. Also, if you are interested, you can also join in our event on September 23rd, but it will using Bahasa Indonesia. Yeah, it will be burden, but that's why we propose a partnership between smallholder and company. That's my answer.
Thank you, Ricky, for answering the question. So next, the quick question is for Dimas. 이건 한국말로 질문이 들어와서 한국말로 답변하겠습니다. 법률 문제를 해결하기 위한 여러 해결책들. 예를 들면 인도네시아 차원의 법 집행, 지속 가능성 기준, 이것들이 발표에서는 큰 도움이 되지 않는다고 말했습니다. 팜유 생산 과정에서 발생하는 환경적인, 사회적인 문제를 해결하는 핵심은 무엇이라고 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
Okay. Wait a second. Okay. Thank you very much. Right now, the solution we think is currently the main thing is how the government evaluate the permits, all permits in oil plantation. In the evaluation process is how law enforcement is related to the practice of law violation that occur. It's about how the oil plantation make sure that they not make the environmental damage and about human rights is more protect in Indonesia, because in Indonesia a lot of criminalization for the people who protect their village or to protect their environment is more larger in this day. We know that what happened in our country or in Central Kalimantan is a lot of people who need to protect in their area. Hello, can you hear me? Because
Yes.
Hello. Okay, thank you. Maybe something like that.
Thank
We
you.
need to evaluate the permits.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's one more question for Korean presentation. So 이건 한국말로 들어와서 한국말로 말씀드리겠습니다. 한국에서는 왜 이런 에너지원을 재생에너지로 인정하고 보조하는지 정말 이해가 되지 않습니다. 바이오 연료의 품질뿐만 아니라 기후위기에 대응할 수 있는 재생에너지를 규정하기 위한 실질적인 기준을 강화한다면 구체적으로 어떤 평가 기준이 있을지 궁금합니다. 한국에서도 적용할 만한 예시가 있는지 알려주세요. 여기에 대한 답변은 제가 드리도록 하겠습니다. 국내에서는 바이오 디젤과 바이오 중유를 신재생에너지법에서 재생에너지로 인정하면서 보조금의 형태인 다양한 형태의 보조금을 받고 있습니다. 혹은 보조 정책이라고 하죠. 네, 바이오 연료의 품질 기준만 현재는 존재하고 있는데 예를 들면은 이 실제로 바이오 에너지가 온실가스를 저감하는지에 대한 기준은 없고 또 이것이 현지의 원산지의 환경을 파괴하는지 혹은 인권 문제를 야기하는지에 대한 기준은 없습니다. 그래서 이런 기준을 도입하기 위한 움직임이 국내에서도 진행은 되고 있지만 아주 낮은 단계입니다. 예를 들면 K-텍소노미라는 제도를 통해서 이제 바이오 에너지를 투자할 때 혹은 채권을 발행할 때 일정 수준의 환경 기준을 맞추도록 하는 내용은 있지만 이것도 이제 처음 만드는 안에 불과하고 아직 확정된 것은 없습니다. 따라서 국내에서도 예를 들면은 영국에서 있었던 입법처럼 이렇게 천연림 파괴와 열대림 파괴를 야기하고 기후 문제를 악화시키는 제품의 경우에는 국내에서 판매할 수 없도록 하는 법이 제정되어야 한다고 생각하고 바이오 연료의 경우에도 이런 연료를 사용할 때 보조금을 받을 수 없도록 하는 인정 기준이 마련되어야 한다고 생각합니다. Thank you. The next question is for Sayoko. And the question is about how do we, you mentioned that there's annual ranking of corporations that you have done in the past. Can you share with us the results of the campaigns, if that really worked well in terms of companies making new commitments? And also, can you explain a little bit more about fit sustainability standards and what are the challenges that you have faced? You mentioned that it's not a perfect regulation at this point. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how to improve the standard and how to overcome the challenge from civil society perspective. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。最初の、企業の、パーム油のユーザー企業に対する、ランキングですけれども、結構分野別にやっていまして、例えばお菓子だったり、インスタント食品だったり、スーパーマーケットみたいな小売だったりというふうにやっています。で、何年か、もう5年以上やっているんですけれども、以前と比べると、だいぶその進化というか企業側の取り組みは特にトップ企業と言われるような企業の取り組みはだいぶ進んできていまして、最初の頃はその RSPO って、まだ RSPO に加盟すればいいんでしょうとかそういう感じだったのが今は、現状ではその NDPE の方針を取り入れたという企業が大手で、数社見られます。例えば花王だったり、花王って石鹸とかクリーナーとか洗浄剤、皆さんシャンプーとかご存知かもしれませんけど、花王だったり、あとは富士製油という大きなオイル 日本では一番たくさん食品系の油を使っている B2B の会社ですけど、ここも、その NDP 方針を取り入れて、でかなり積極的に動いています。花王とか富士製油、あと日清食品、カップヌードルの大手ですけれども、そういったところが方針取り入れた以外に、あと最近ではミルリストの公開を求めてきまして、これも対応している企業が複数、今言ったような企業がいくつかあります。でこれらの、一つのきっかけは実は東京オリンピックでした。東京オリンピックはそこまで求めているレベルは認証だったら何でもいいなんですけれども、RSPO だけじゃなくて MSPO、ISPO でもいいということなんですけれども、でもオリンピックを機会にNDP 方針が取り入れられる結果になったというところはあります。これはNGO の働きかけがあったからなんですけれども、ただ全体を見るとまだまだ、理解も進んでいませんし、RSPO に入った企業の数はすごく増えましたけど、NDP 方針については、全体での理解はまだまだこれからかなと思っています。でフィットの方に関しましては、フィットの基準は、とりあえず今、ある基準というのはですね、これはパーム油に関する基準なんです。でパーム油以外の、例えば今私たちが一番注目しているのは輸入の木質バイオマス、ベトナム、カナダ、アメリカからの輸入が急速に増えていて、でこちらも早く基準を検討してほしいんですけど、こちらの基準は全然議論にも上がっていないような状況ですし、先ほど申し上げたようにその、ライフサイクルでの温室効果ガス排出についても、議論はしてますけれども、非常に緩いことになりそうな気配です。まだ結果は出ていないんですけれども、農地転換、新たに森林を農地に変えたところは、炭素ストックの減少をカウントするけど、そうじゃないところはカウントしない。つまり森林が劣化していてもカウントしないとか、そういうことに、今は提案されていて、私たちとしてはそれでは不十分だと。IPCC が求めているのもそうではないんじゃないか、そうではないということで、基本的にはそのカーボンニュートラルという扱いそのものをやめてほしいというふうに働きかけています。これが入るかどうかというのは非常にチャレンジで、EU でもまだそこまでなかなかいってないと理解してますけれども、やはり2050年までのカーボンニュートラル達成のためにはそれが絶対に必要だというふうに働きかけています。
Thank you, Sayoko, for your answers. I think you made a nice transition to the next question. Actually, is about carbon neutrality myth that we're all dealing with. It seems that you also mentioned that the Japanese government is considering biofuels as carbon neutral, and that is really deterring the damages that, to address the damages of the biofuels industry there. So next question is actually for Laura. If you're there, I would like to ask a question about your experience in dealing with the carbon neutrality debate in the EU, and how civil societies in the EU were able to achieve these wins that you have mentioned about the limit setting and phasing out plans of crop-based biofuels. And you also mentioned that you're still negotiating the terms. So if you can also talk about a little bit about what kind of challenges that are remaining to be addressed. Okay.
Thanks
There
a
you
lot
go.
for the question. So two different parts in your question. So the first one on carbon neutrality and the challenge to bring that on the debate and to have the wins that we got at EU level. So first, I would say that we were lucky to have a group of NGOs with many different sides of the debate, active since the beginning, so since 2008, 2009, where a lot of NGOs already raised awareness about the issues of food-based biofuels. So we had not only climate-based NGOs, but also NGOs like ActionAid, focusing much more on human rights aspects and the competition with food and the issue with food prices. So I think climate neutrality is one part of the debate, but to win and to make progress on biofuels, you need to look at all the different impacts, the negative impacts they have. So it's a combination of different elements in the debate that manage to bring the topic very high on the agenda and to make the changes that we've seen. What has also helped a lot is the fact that the EU commissioned several studies on land use impacts of biofuels. And I think without that, it would have been very difficult to make the changes that we've seen, especially on palm oil and on soy, and more generally on food-based biofuels. So making sure that you have data available and that the science is there to support your arguments is crucial. Another element, I think, which is becoming more and more important in Europe is the fact that there's more and more concerns about air quality in cities. There's a lot of countries that are trying to move away from internal combustion engines. And you see that with biodiesel use in transport, it's actually not helping in terms of air quality. And that also helps, I think, raise the awareness about the fact that it's not a good answer to the climate challenge. It's not a good answer in terms of biodiversity. It's not a good answer in terms of human rights, but it's also not helping in terms of air quality in cities. And here, if you want to have more information, the International Council on Clean Transportation released a report earlier this year on that question of air quality, which I think is important. It's in the US context, but it can be also used, I think, for other countries. And the final point I wanted to raise regarding the challenges going ahead, I think well, first, the main challenge would be about what's happening with the WTO cases that I mentioned. We're confident that the EU took the right decision and has a strong legal basis to do the phase out of high alloc risk biofuels, but we still need to see what the WTO panels will issue in the coming year. So that's really something to keep an eye on. And the second challenge is really, as I mentioned, the question of aviation and shipping, because if it's clear that electrification will increase and really see an uptake in the road transport sector, there's still a lot of question marks for aviation and shipping, and we're really concerned that there, we might have the need to do another debate on biofuels. Maybe to close the point there, another important aspect for Europe is the fact that we rely also a lot on EU crops that are so subject to extreme weather events, with climate change becoming stronger. And that's also another argument which I think is important to raise, that basing our energy policy on agricultural crops that are really subject to a lot of changes depending on the year, on the harvest, and on the climate impact is really not a good energy policy, and we should rather rely on types of renewable energies that can be produced domestically, like renewable electricity from wind and solar. And that's really the message we want to pass to EU decision makers. I hope I answered your question, but don't hesitate to let me know if you want more details.
Thank you, Laura. I think you've answered all the questions that was raised. Yeah, especially I wanted to touch upon the point that you have raised at the end of your answer. So there are situations that we see some similarities between the EU policy and what's happening in Asia as well. I think a good example is biofuels making up of a higher portion of the renewable energy. I think that is exactly what we're seeing in South Korea as well. So it wasn't mentioned in the presentation earlier today, but the bioenergy consists of 30+% of the entire renewable electricity generation. So that actually has been the most subsidized energy source in renewable energy, and people are not aware of those, and people tend to forget that. that when we say like solar and wind are all the renewable energies we have, but that is actually not the case. Biofuels, we run on biofuels. So I think that was the reason why we wanted to have this international webinar to raise awareness on this. And because we have some investment communities joining in the webinar as well, I wanted to raise this question for all speakers. Maybe if you can comment on that part, that what kind of socio-environmental risks that the investors should be aware of, and what kind of policy environment that we are projecting in the future that are critical in this in the supply chain risks of biofuels. Maybe we can start that question with Laura, if you are willing to go first.
Sure, happy to give the perspectives from the EU. So from an investment perspective, it's clear that for us, investments in food-based biofuels, whether it's palm oil, soy, ethanol from wheat, or sugar beet in Europe, that's not the way to go. That's really not the future that we want for the alternatives to oil in transport. What's more interesting is perhaps to look at some waste and residue-based biofuels, but here again, there's a lot of challenges. The availability is limited. You have other industries competing for the same feedstocks. So eventually, we don't think that the field of biofuels is a really stable and a field that we feel confident investors should go in. As was mentioned before, I think it's, the cleanest alternatives lie into wind and solar, and potentially renewable hydrogen production when it's done in the proper way. And so that's really where investment should go in the future, not into food-based biofuels, a bit into waste and residue-based biofuels, but as I said, it's quite complicated as well, and we haven't had the time to discuss that in more details here, but there's also a lot of challenges when it comes to waste and residues. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Next question, the same question I would like to ask to Sayoko as well.
はい、ありがとうございます。そうですね、投資家に向けてということですと、やっぱりバイオ燃料のその持続可能性の確認は、基本的にはマテリアル利用の場合とそんなに変わらないかなと思っています。つまり、パーム油に関しては、あるいは森林マテリアルに関しては NDPE なんですけれども、やっぱり加えてその GHG の排出について、サプライチェーン全体で見ることが、サプライチェーンというかバリューチェーンというか全体で見ることが大事かなと思っています。というのは、ピートから出るのももちろん非常に膨大ですけれども、加えて、さっき少しお話ししたそのミルの搾油工場の廃液ポンドにおけるその廃液の処理の仕方で温室効果ガスの出方がもう全然違ったりとかしますし、あとそのパームの廃棄物というと例えばパームトランクとかエンプティフルーツバンチもあるんですけど、そういったものの処理の仕方でもかなり排出量が変わるというふうに言われています。このあたりまだ私たちも勉強中なんですけれども、トータルで見て、おそらくパーム油はもうエネルギー利用には全くそのもの主産物としてはエネルギー利用にはするべきではないけれども、廃棄物に関しては適正な利用をすることで逆にその GHG をもしかしてうまく抑えることができるかもしれない。そういった点がポメの利用ですとか、そういうパームトランク、エンプティフルーツバンチなどの利用をちゃんと行うということは可能性を持っているんじゃないかなと思います。そういったことに日本の投資家もですね、投資機関の中にはパーム油を非常に重視しているところもありますので、そういった情報交換というのはすごく大事なことかなと思っています。
Thank you, Sayoko, for sharing your perspectives as well. I wanted to ask the same question to Ricky about your messages for the investment communities on supply chain risks. Thank you.
Yeah. In Indonesia context, we want biodiesel is more transparent, traceable, and also sustainable. In particular, we want biodiesel not to be a single feedstock because it can increase the risk of land use change. It can be better if we can switching to using second generation, even third generation of biodiesel, and also involve smallholder in the biodiesel trade system. That also can reduce the risk of land use change. That's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to ask the same question to Shin-young as well.
네, 아까 제가 발표 중에도 말씀드렸는데 그 팜유를 사용하는 그 기업들이 굉장히 많이 있습니다. 그래서 오늘은 저희가 주로 바이오 연료를 생산하는 바이오 디젤, 그다음에 바이오 중유를 쓰는 뭐 이렇게 발전소를 위주로 이야기를 했지만 뭐 음식을 생산하는 기업도 있고 여러 가지 생활 관련된 물건들을 상품들을 이제 만드는 기업들도 있는데 이런 기업들의 이제 투자를 할 때 투자자들이 과연 이런 팜유 관련된 것까지 세밀하게 보고 있나라고 하면은 사실은 그렇지가 않은 것이 현실입니다. 특히나 이제 한국의 투자자들은 그런 점에 있어서 투자 과정에서 최근에는 뭐 사회적 책임 투자라든지 뭐 ESG 같은 이야기들이 논의가 시작이 되고 있지만 아직 그것이 뭐 의무화가 된 것이 아니고 아직 굉장히 이제 초기 단계이기 때문에 아직 갈 길이 굉장히 멀다고 생각하고요. 그런 과정에서 이런 원료, 특히 팜유와 같이 리스크가 굉장히 높은 그런 원료에 대해서는 별도로 고려를 하는 그런 것들이 많이 필요하다고 생각하고 그것을 돕기 위한 과정 중에 하나로 기업들이 자발적인 오늘도 뭐 여러 번 얘기가 나왔지만 NDP 정책 같은 것을 채택하는 것이 도움이 될 수 있다고 생각을 하고요. 그리고 가장 중요하게는 정부가 하루속히 그런 서플라이 체인과 관련된 거기 관련 기업들이 정보를 다 공개하고 그래서 이제 관련자들이 모니터링을 할 수 있는 그런 기반을 만들어 주는 것이 굉장히 중요하다고 생각을 합니다. 물론 이게 이제 전체를 완전히 이제 안전한 서플라이 체인을 보장해 줄 수 있냐라고 하면은 그건 사실은 또 이제 다른 문제, 현장에서의 임플레멘테이션이 늘 이제 문제가 있기 때문에 완벽한 제도는 없겠지만 지금 이제 안 되고 있는 부분들을 조금씩 보충해 나가는 것이 필요하고 지금 사실 투자자들이 기업과 관련된 이런 정보를 획득하기에 너무 이제 부족한 상황이기 때문에 한국 같은 경우에는 어쨌든 급하게는 기업들이 그런 자발적인 정책들을 채택하고 또 장기로 가면 안 되고 어쨌든 최대한 빨리 한국 정부도 관련된 법제들을 정비해서 이런 고위험 원료에 대한 정보가 공개되고 또 구체적으로 사회적인, 환경적인, 인권적인 부분들이 평가되는 그런 시스템이 마련이 되는 것이 굉장히 중요할 것이라고 생각을 합니다.
Thank you very much for your answers. As Shin-young rightly pointed out that the situation in Korea is grave. We do not have any sustainability standard. Not to mention that sustainability standard is a panacea, but I would like to mention that, for example, not allowing direct land use change driven biofuels, or having a set date for phasing out, or setting a maximum percentage of use of certain feedstock. Just those basic things are not in place. But we do have blending mandates, and the goals are increasing every year. And that really worries us because we are seeing some tougher measurements and regulations in the EU and the US. And we think that maybe those who didn't meet the standards there would be coming to Korea being a dumping ground of these bad fuels. And that is very likely scenario. So yeah, the part of the reason why we organize this event is to really raise awareness around this issue and address the concerns that I just raised. Yeah, so that, and then I think I would like to, since we have a little bit of time, maybe I can ask one more question about sustainability standards. It has been mentioned so many times by many speakers that there are different measures in place, or countries are considering different measures. For example, the EU and the Japanese case were mentioned, and Indonesia is also working on the ISBI that Ricky had pointed out. These are important effort, but however, I was curious to ask our speakers how you look at it, like, as obviously these sustainability standards are not silver bullets, but how do we use that argument of introducing sustainability standard and use it in our campaign messaging, and how do we not fall into this mistake of getting bogged down into this sustainability debate when we actually can put our effort in completely phasing out or introducing a legislation that just completely ban these unsustainable feedstock. So maybe I can go around and ask questions, starting Shin-young, please.
네, 한국의 경우는 저희가 이제 말씀드린 것처럼 그런 지속 가능성에 대한 기준이 전혀 없기 때문에 사실은 이제 이거를 좀 도입해라라고 말해야 되는 시점에서 이게 이제 얼마나 효과가 있을지에 대해서 이제 이야기를 하는 게 조금 조심스러운 것 같기는 합니다. 어쨌든 이제 말씀해 주신 것처럼 이게 이제 모든 거를 해결하는 그런 기준이 될 수는 없는 거고, 아까 이제 그 유럽 발제자분도 말씀해 주셨는데, 중요하게는 예를 들어서 그런 내연 기관차가 이제 없어져야 된다라는 이런 방향에 대해서 제시를 해주셨는데, 지금 우리 사회가 얼마나 이런 화석 연료에 의존하고 있던 것을 그럼 이번에는 소위 바이오 연료에 의존하는 방식으로 단순히 그런 우리가 태우는 물질을 전환하는 방식으로는 이 문제를 해결할 수 없다라는 거를 인식하는 게 가장 급하지 않을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 우리가 살던 대로, 살아온 방식대로 살아가기 위해서 계속해서 다른 그런 연료를 찾는다면은 절대로 그런 정말 완벽한 그런 해결책은 나올 수 없다고 생각을 하고, 우리가 해결책을 모색하는 과정에서 가장 우선시해야 하는 거는 우리가 지금까지 살아온 방식들에 대해서 다시 한번 검토를 다시 하고, 조금 더 우리가 이런 생태계를 더 이상 파괴하지 않고 살아갈 수 있는 방식으로 하기 위해서는 어떤 전환이 필요한지에 대해서 고민을 하는 것이 필요하고, 그런 지속 가능성 기준을 논의할 때도 그래서 단순히 뭐 어떤 기준들, 아까도 뭐 일본의 경우를 말씀해 주셨는데 뭐 RSPO를 뭐 받으면 괜찮다라는 식으로 하고 있다는 얘기를 했는데, 그건 굉장히 아직 문제가 많은 제도라는 것을 알고 있거든요, 저희가. 그래서 그런 뭔가 껍데기라고 해야 되나, 그런 레이블에 의존하는 것이 아니라, 뭔가 제3자가 인증해 주는 것에 의존하는 것이 아니라 정말로 그런 현장에서 일어날 수 있는 변화들, 우리도, 그리고 그냥 누군가가 그거 그냥 팜유를 어떻게든 알아서 인권 침해 없이 환경에 파괴하지 않고 누군가가 알아서 만들어주면 안 될까라는 식으로 타인한테 그 문제를 전가하는 게 아니라, 우리가 살아가는 방식, 어떻게 하면 조금 더 그런 화석연료가 됐든 바이오연료가 됐든 이런 것들을 의존적인 삶의 방식을 바꿔 나갈 수 있을까라는 고민을 같이 시작해야지 이 지속 가능성에 대한 논의가 의미가 있지 않을까라는 조금 막연한 얘기를 하면서 마무리를 하도록 하겠습니다.
감사합니다. Thank you. Yeah, can Laura expand your point on the sustainability debate as well, please?
Sure, thanks a lot for the question. I think it's a crucial question and really the core of the discussion today. And I think sustainability standards can be a first step to really avoid the worst case scenario. However, it doesn't tackle the issue of leakages. So what I've shown with indirect land use change. So in the case of the EU, we have sustainability standards. We have a policy that prohibits direct deforestation and direct destruction of peatlands and high carbon stocks, and still it has negative impacts on climate and on biodiversity. So it's a first step, as well as transparency, which is helpful to kind of raise the awareness about the issue, but it's clearly not solving the problem. And I would draw here a distinction between the discussions on palm oil production and crop production for food and for biofuels. For biofuels, we have a policy that forces the use of certain products on drivers. And for food or feed, it's a free market. It's really customers that basically make the decision. And I think it's important to distinguish these two questions. And that's why for energy purposes, we really think that limits and phasing out the use of food-based biofuels is the most efficient. You can have discussions about sustainability standards and all that for food production. I think it's really important to have them. But for biofuels, after 10 years of discussions at EU level on sustainability safeguards, it's clear that the only way to move to a cleaner transport system is to limit and phase out food-based biofuels, not to dive into endless discussions on sustainability criteria. But as I said, it's a first step and discussions are at different levels in different countries. But yeah, that would be at least the experience from the EU that the thing that worked best is really to limit and phase out. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing your perspectives. I think it's really important point that you have raised, that the lessons learned from the EU is that you have fought so much. The civil society have worked so hard in the last 10 years, trying to fine-tune the safeguard system. However, really the solution is, the ideal solution is to phasing it out or ban it. I think that was the point that I wanted to ask. Like, how do we try not to repeat mistakes that were made before, and how do we leapfrog from, skip some some efforts to get to the end goal? I think that was the main reason why I asked this question to you all. So I would like to ask if Sayoko has anything to add.
はい、ありがとうございます。非常に、示唆に富む議論だなと思います。私たちもその食品をフィットの方では持続可能性基準で新規燃料の食品はダメというのが、今年決まりましたが、パーム油はもともと入ってるから OK と。それはおかしな話で、もともと入っていても持続可能性は以前から求められていたので、食品も食品だからダメだということにしてくださいというふうに伝えています。そのように政策を変えていく取り組みと同時に、さっきの話にあったように、政策が変わるのにやっぱりすごく時間がかかって、どうしても遠回りになってしまう。それは必ずやらなければいけない、働きかけなければいけないけれども、時間がかかるので、一方で、金融機関ですとか、発電所を実際に運営している企業、大手の商社などに直接働きかけていくということも大事だと思っています。で、特に金融機関に関しては、まだバイオマス発電、バイオマス燃料は ESG 扱いになっているので、そうではないんじゃないかと。化石燃料よりも排出量が多いものを ESG の対象にするのは間違っているということをもっと早く強く、伝えていく必要があると考えています。で、デマンドコントロールの話がさっきありましたけれども、やっぱり廃食油は結構廃食油を使うことはいいんですけれども、難しい点とがあるというのはやっぱりその量的な問題もありますし、日本ではですね、食品リサイクル法という法律で実は廃食油はカスケード利用が義務付けられています。これすごく皮肉な話で、廃食油をエネルギーに使おうと思ったら3番目なんですね。動物の餌、次が肥料、次がエネルギーです。これが法律で決まっているのに、 なんていうか、一時的な産品であるパーム油とか、バイオマス、木質バイオマスに関してはカスケード利用の義務付けがないという非常に皮肉な状況になっていて、こういった状況が他のところでも起きてくるのは困るので、やっぱ同じようなことにならないようにカスケード利用をどんなものであってもきちんと義務付ける必要があると思います。で、EU は例えば日本とか東南アジア、中国などからたくさんのその廃食油を実は輸入していて、これもやはり廃棄物であっても生産地で利用すべきであって、地球の反対側まで燃料を使って運んでいたらその分の余計な排出もありますし、コストもかかるので、やはり廃棄物はその地産地消というか、発生したところで使うということももっと意識していく必要があるかなと思います。すみません、ありがとうございます。
Thank you, Sayoko, for your comment on that. Yeah, as you pointed out as well, the importance of data was mentioned twice. I think Laura has mentioned earlier too, that making people aware of higher greenhouse gas emissions produced by biofuels is the first step, that people should know that by numbers, looking at numbers, that there's clear evidence that this is true. And also, you have mentioned the used cooking oil case, that importing large quantities of used cooking oil itself isn't very ideal as well. And we're seeing that upward trend in Korea as well, and we are quite concerned about that as well. That was also addressed in our report, that the portion of used cooking oil in biodiesel and bioheavy oil is actually reducing because of availability of used cooking oil within Korea, and we have to import them. I think up to that point, we're getting up to that point, it means there's a problem in the system. So yeah, we want to clarify that as well. I was wondering if Ricky has anything else to add to this question as well.
Yeah, thank you. For traction experience, we're trying to encourage companies and government. This is related to long-term development. We have long-term short-term development plan, mid-term development plan, and long-term development plan. Our approach has always been to emphasize that no business will survive in crisis situation. Sustainability not only emphasize on environmental issue, but also social and economic issue, and this has a meaning. Maybe they will gain a profit today, but they will lose tomorrow, kind of thing. And lately, we're trying to use economic approach, and it went quite well. We're also trying to connect it, sustainable investors to companies and also government, so they have more options to development planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. You're in the middle of this ISBI working group that you have mentioned, and we are very interested to know the development of the standard and how it comes out. So yeah, we look forward to exchanging more information with you in the future. I am very sorry, Dimas, I have forgot to ask the investor-related questions to you before, and now that it's your turn, do you have anything else to add at this point? Any comments? Please feel free to share your perspectives as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Currently, the main thing is how not to re-expand oil palm plantation permits. 20 million hectares of oil palm plantation in Indonesia is more than enough. Because of this 20 million hectares, there are still many problems that must be resolved as soon as possible, including those related to land conflict, violation human rights, waste and fires that often occur in the process of expanding land and improving environmental conditions. Plantation investment no longer needs to be provided with facility without a gradual evaluation process and better environmental governance improvements. The company improve the process of free consent, recognition of community territories, and more review of environmental protection in good management of oil palm plantation. Because the process of environmental improvement will be more expensive than the process when doing environmental damage. Speaking of sustainability, regardless of the aforementioned aspect, problems in the oil plantation sector will continue to occur. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dimas. Yeah, you raised an important point that, yeah, whether or not there's sustainability standard in place, yeah, the demand is on the rise, and yeah, it may not stop the expansion of oil palm plantations in Indonesia. So yeah, with that, yeah, I think we're over time at this point. I wanted to thank you all the participants to join the webinar today, and also thank you for our speakers to join and share these valuable discussions with us. Especially, I wanted to thank Dimas for joining us in the middle of natural disaster that is happening in East Kalimantan, is experiencing severe flooding, and I hope the situations will get better soon. And yeah, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to share the link for downloading a report and all the presentation materials in the webinar. And if you would like to receive emails on that, please also let us know. And yeah, with that, I want to thank you all and thank you everyone, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.